Hi everyone, this is Andrei Marasoiu. I'm an assistant lecturer in the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest, and I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at ICU. This is the Research Institute, the Humanities Division at the same university. It's quite a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share with you a talk that I prepared for the Aristotelian Society in open session. And I'm very grateful to the organizers at the University of Hertfordshire. And um, I'm also very grateful to um, my dissertation committee at the University of Virginia, where I defended in April 2019. Dissertation title, What is it to Understand? Bree Gertler, Jim Cargyle, Paul Humphreys did a fantastic job. They read several versions of this. I'm incredibly grateful. And I'd also like to thank the audience at an online understanding conference that I organized at the University of Bucharest this past May, and especially David Bourget and Stephen Grimm, who did a fantastic job sort of asking a bunch of questions about my project and helping me see the light. And I'm also grateful to two anonymous reviewers who helped you see different ways that this could be put, different problems, different venues of further exploration. Thanks so much. And I should say, and I'm happy to say, that in its current version, this work is supported by a grant of the Romanian Ministry of Education and Research. The code for that is PN-P1-1-PD-2019-0535. And I'm very grateful to our public sponsor for research, and also to my mentor in this project, Mircea Dumitru, for his constant encouragement, for helping me see what's important, and for guiding me throughout. Okay, so my talk is titled Need, Grasp, Be Conscious, and it's somewhat at the crossroads of the philosophy of mind, epistemology, and what I'd like to give you first is a roadmap. And well, basic question is, how are conscious experience and understanding related? This is something that has been on my mind for quite a while now. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on the phenomenal theory of grasp and understanding that's been proposed by David Bourget. And according to that theory, grasp occurs all and only in conscious experience. And by conscious throughout, I'll just mean phenomenally conscious. Okay, so this might be attended by attention or it might not. But what we're interested in is the kind of phenomenal consciousness, right? What it's like to undergo a certain experience. Now I discuss various hypothetical scenarios. In fact, I'll try and delve into two of those in light of Bourget's theory, and I'll question the main line of argument he offers in favor of his own theory. I won't. My talk isn't meant to say that David is wrong. My talk is meant to explore some of the issues that had been at stake between the phenomenal theory of grasp and various other theories of grasp. And the upshot is just to take stock of the diversity of understanding and grasp in point of both their relationships to conscious experience and their epistemic profile. So I should preface all this. There's going to be a bit of setting the stage by saying that, to my mind at least, we could distinguish varieties of understanding. Okay, so there's something it's like to understand the words that I'm just saying. Okay, and there's something it's like to understand the visual scene, something that goes on in front of your eyes. And there's something it's like to understand how to dance and how to, how to foxtrot, how to tango, etc. And there's something it's like to understand the plight that someone who's lost a loved one is going through. Okay, this emotional understanding. And there's something it's like to understand, to have a kind of intellectual epiphany, right? To understand, say, the rudiments of Newtonian mechanics. Maybe you see the world with different eyes. Okay? And of course, all of these are mixed. right? In typical cases of understanding, what's going on is that um, so just take a few obvious examples of mixed cases. Say religious understanding, right? Someone who has a sort of religious understanding, whatever their confession might be, or whether they've just posed the problem and but they're not committed to a certain confession or faith, um, might um, have a certain worldview. This would be a cognitive issue, and they might emotionally resonate with various issues, and this would be a kind of emotional understanding. And they might have a certain practical understanding of what should be done in certain circumstances, and they might have a certain perceptual understanding of what's right if they see something that's right happening, or whether they see something that looks wrong, right? And they might use words a certain way. So all of these seem to be blended together, and they seem to be interwoven in typical cases of say, religious understanding. And this is just one kind, right? There's so many kinds of mixed understanding. I'm going to try to sort of tease apart the intellectual components of understanding, because it seems to me that they're worth exploring on their own. And so, to the extent that you think this is too much of an abstraction, maybe bear with me for a moment and see if what I'll say right at the end suits your intuitions or not. Um, Intellectual understanding, however, could also be subjected to the same kind of treatment, right? So you could say, look, it's one thing to understand the world, say to understand how bodies move, right? Kind of physical understanding, right? And it's another thing to understand how come if you mix various substances, you'll see that there's carbon dioxide that gets released and so on, chemical understanding. Right? And it's a very different thing to say, well, I understand why it is that after it's very hot outside, maybe sometimes it rains, and so you have a kind of climate science-based understanding or just an intuitive one. Or you could say, well, it's something it's like to understand why 2 plus 2 is 4. Right? That's mathematical understanding. Or there's something it's like to understand, at least in part, what's depicted in a painting by Picasso. Right? That's aesthetic understanding. All of these differ widely, so you might think there's a kind of domain-specific approach to intellectual understanding. That said, what I'm going to try to do is just raise a concern that maybe there is something in the way of a unified, albeit partial, characterization of intellectual understanding, perhaps in full generality. And maybe that's wrong, but it's at least a starting point, right? So I'll just bracket the issue of the sundry varieties of intellectual understanding. Um, so just to set the stage, remember Bourget's view concerns understanding and grasp. And so we need to account for the relationship between understanding and grasp. Right? So here's what he says. The purely mental component of dispositional understanding is dispositional grasp. Okay? So if, say, um, I understand the behavior of some macroscopic physical bodies in terms of Newtonian mechanics. I jot down the relationships between instantaneous velocity and acceleration and so on. The mental component of all of that is what I grasp of the body's behavior in terms of Newtonian mechanics. And whether that's accurate or not, whether that fits the world or not, is pertains to understanding, but not to grasp, right? Something of the sort. And then Bourget also conjectures this, but I think a very nice discussion of the relationship between occurrent and dispositional is done by Bartlett. But we could say, right, dispositional grasp is acquired and subsequently manifested in episodes of occurrent grasp. Okay? So dispositional would be occurrent. So just consider that I ask you what the capital of Peru is. Okay. Now you're thinking about it. You weren't thinking about it a moment ago, but you still knew it, right? So this is the run-of-the-mill idea that the dispositional knowledge that you have about the capital of Peru um, is now occurring. You've just brought it up to light again, to the surface of your consciousness, right? And so the thought is this applies to grasp as well, right? So I could, right, seek to and perhaps succeed in grasping the behavior of a macroscopic physical body in terms of Newtonian mechanics. Um, but I still possess the dispositional state, right? I'm still able to do it, even if I don't actually go through the motions, right? In my cognition, that is. Okay, so now with that, let's turn to David Bourget's phenomenal view of grasp. So he says, quote, to currently grasp P is to have a phenomenal experience with P as content. And he glosses this in the following way. To have a thought with content P while grasping P just is to experience P. Okay. So the just is there, okay, seems to suggest that this is identity that we're talking about. This is reciprocal constitution, okay? Then he goes on to say, it seems that grasping is independent of such epistemic factors as justification and truth. We can, in any case, distinguish a purely mental component to the state. That is what I mean by grasping. Okay? So this adds something to what we had on the previous slide here. Namely, that the purely mental component is in some sense not constitutively anchored in epistemic factors, right? Justification, truth, and so on. Now, that's partly going to be an issue in what I'm going to be saying because, well, maybe not truth, but why not justification? Why not other epistemic factors? Right? Okay, so this is David Bourget's phenomenal view of grasp, but we get a grip on it when we see its intuitive bonus. Okay, so this view does justice to the common sense thought that experiences of understanding differ significantly in point of phenomenal character. So suppose that in conscious thought, one has to grasp both the genesis of Lutheranism and of bleak projections for climate change. What it is like to think of Lutheranism shares little. This is just an introspective report with what it is like to think of climate change. Correspondingly, what it is to currently grasp each of these will also differ. Why so? Because, remember, to currently grasp P just is to have the conscious experience with content P. So part of the variety of experiences associated with understanding, Bourget's view suggests, is due to differences in what is understood. However, we need to compare something. And this is the starting point for what I'm after. We have the evidence available, and we have the metaphysical claim, right? We have what's being theorized, and we have a theory of it. The evidence is this, in Bourget's own words, there's at least a rough prima facie correlation between the availability of relevant episodes of phenomenal consciousness and the capacity to grasp a given content. Which one? Well, the one that's consciously experienced. Right? See the difference with the metaphysical claim. The metaphysical claim is this: to currently grasp P just is, okay, to have a phenomenal experience with P as content. Seems to be a difference. Rough prima facie correlations don't sufficiently support claims of metaphysical constitution, right? They do give some support, but they don't seem to give enough support. Right? So this is going to be something that's going to be at play in what follows. And so if we were to try to in some sense say that Bourget's view is wrong, here's maybe what we need to look for. We would need to look for non-experiential grasp, a current grasp to be sure, or we would need to look for Conscious experience is the content of which we fail to grasp, content that, notwithstanding, stays cognitive. Remember Bourdieu's definition. And we need, if we can latch on to some such scenarios, we need to make sure that these are not just flights of fancy. They're not just figments of our imagination. They're genuinely possible. Right? Because if not, merely the kind of stuff we can prima facie think about doesn't tell us that those things can actually occur, right? And can possibly occur. Right? So it's not enough to just find the scenarios. We need to, in some sense, characterize them in a more robust, phenomenological and epistemological way. Okay? So here's a starting point. This is borrowed from A.C. Ewing. This is just a fantastic thought, and I'm very grateful I found this. Right. So here's what Ewing says. Quote, a philosophy may, like Spinoza's, find its culmination point in an intuition which goes beyond the reasoning that has preceded it, though it might never have been possible but for that reasoning. Okay? It's incredibly rich. Right? So what do I mean by that? There's a lot packed in. Right? So there's this kind of dispositional via current distinction. Right. So you could have Spinoza's philosophy at your fingertips, right? But still not actively think about it, not currently think about it, okay? And maybe as you read Spinoza over and over again, you don't have any sort of a current experience of how it all blends together, but somehow there's some incubation going on in your cognition, and things do so arrange so that you do have a unified view, even if only dispositionally. Okay? Then there's the epistemic v phenomenal bit, right? So imagine yourself reading Spinoza's Ethics, right, or the treatise De Emendatione, right? You could read that with an apparent feeling of incomprehension, right? But things might still, notwithstanding, align, and you might still form a unified conception of what that philosophy is. Even if it seems to you you're not getting it, it's not entirely clear that that seeming phenomenal incomprehension is a good tracker for what you're really getting epistemically out of it, right? And just imagine that as your expertise grows, you might second guess yourself more. So these two might go hand in hand, even though we shouldn't conflate, we shouldn't mistake one for the other, right? Okay. And Spinoza is actually a terrific example here because there are these steps in knowledge, right? Imaginative, then based on reasoning, then intuitive, right? So just imagine if you were to actually go through those steps as you read Spinoza. What's the relationship there between your conscious experiences and what you're epistemically getting out of it, right? That might shift. And so part of what's at issue here is, well, what's a proposition? Right? We're used to thinking of proposition as what gets expressed by sentences that are uttered or in some sense inscribed or produced in context. Right? But there's no clear reason for why that should be constitutive of propositions rather than of sentences alone. And perhaps of our language practices and habits. So the question of what a proposition is looms large. And the question matters here because, well, if what's grasped are propositions, that in order to figure out what grasp is, we need to figure out what a proposition is. Okay? And just imagine that there were this chunky, rich proposition that simply characterizes Spinoza's worldview. Right? We would gain partial grasp of it that gets better and better notwithstanding. as we get Spinoza better. Right? And of course, there's a question. Remember, imagination, reasoning, intuition, right? Does the mode of grasping a proposition really matter to understanding it? Right? So not just the proposition, but its mode of presentation for the agent, right? And by that I mean to stay neutral between various accounts of modes of presentation, but the mere gesture and imagination, the reasoning, the intuitiveness seems to suggest that propositions, even when they're the same, they're presented differently, right? If we go about Spinoza's way. So there's a lot packed into you, right? And this seems to suggest an alternative to David Bourget, what I'll call the epistemic view of grasp. Now, David Bourget calls this the inferential view of grasp, and he does point out that there are several other possible versions, but he thinks the inferential view is the most plausible. And so here's what he says. This is his attempt to characterize the opposing view, a view he doesn't share. Quote, an occurrent thought T with content P is an occurrent grasping of P to the extent that T is appropriately inferentially connected to other mental states of the subject. So if this is what he targets, I'm not going to take a stance on whether the arguments he advances against this view are right or not, because I think there's a better way to tackle the issue. But let me just point out that obviously, right, epistemic aspects and phenomenal aspects mix when, for instance, we gain a firmer grasp of Spinoza's philosophy, right? As Ewing's example put it. And so my take is, well, what if maybe this is setting a false dilemma, and Bourget isn't doing this, but we might if we had a sort of hasty reading of what he's doing, right? So couldn't there be some other epistemic accounts of grasp that aren't necessarily inferential? So, for instance, Ernest Sosa thinks that beyond animal knowledge, there's a better knowledge, right? Reflective knowledge. So, why care, right? What is so desirable epistemically about broad coherence, the one that's brought in by this reflective knowledge, Sosa thinks? Well, broad coherence is desirable, he says, because it yields integrated understanding. And presumably, these are factors that count as internal, that count as mental by Bourget's light. And so these are factors that might also pertain to grasp, not just understanding. Right? It's not entirely clear that broad coherence, however cashed out, is necessarily going to be the product of inferential transitions. It might sometimes be, but not necessarily so. Here's another view. Linda Zagzebski says that understanding is a cognitive state that arises from technique. The person who's mastered a technique understands the nature of the product of that technique and is able to explain it. Once again, it's not entirely obvious that this is inferential. So which epistemic norms are relevant here? Well, accessibility of grasp to reflection, doxastic coherence of what is grasped, the ability to explain what is grasped, the manifestation of intellectual virtues, or maybe cognitive skills in the formation of that grasp. And these aren't obviously inferential. It's unclear that any of the epistemic properties mentioned are, and in Bourget's terms, suitably inference-like dispositions. Okay? Consider the very notion of intellectual character, for instance. No inference seems to be required for exhibiting open-mindedness or conscientiousness. Okay? And that seems to be a view that's different from both Bourget's phenomenal view and the epistemic view, and the inferential view, I apologize. So once again, there's a lot packed into that. And Bourget also gestures at this when he talks about getting the idea of a proof. And this is a terrific example. I'm not going to go into that because I'm running out of time. But let me just end with a few um, quick notes, namely that it seems to me that somebody could say, well, look, these epistemic norms could be coded purely dispositionally, right? If there's something pertaining to intellectual character, that seems to be dispositional. If we're talking about the ability to explain what's grasped, that seems to be dispositional. Accessibility of grasp to reflection, again, it's not just the haphazard accidental access that reflection gets to grasp. It seems to be that the thought in question gets to count as grasping what's being thought in it, to the extent that it could be accessed by reflection, right? So there's a dispositional take, and if so, it's no challenge to the phenomenal theory, because the phenomenal theory, remember, pertains to a current grasp, right? It just pertains to a relationship between dispositional and current grasp. I still think that there's a lingering doubt pertaining to what gets to be constitutive of grasp. The phenomenal bit, the epistemic bit, sometimes both. Well, what if sometimes neither, right? Or what if sometimes we best characterize grasp in epistemic terms instead of in phenomenal terms? Now, I'm not saying that the theory is in any way false, right? Nor am I saying that it's true. I'm just saying that, let's put it in Galen Strawson's terms, talk of understanding experience may not be appropriate in all cases in which it's correct to say that someone has understood something. Thank you.